This video is sponsored by Factor. In this video, we'll experiment with a new ground effect vehicle concept that I've been thinking about for a while, and then try to chase it down on this Surf Nico electric surfboard as it autonomously skims around the lake. Then after that, we'll have some fun with the electric surfboard alone and see if it's any good, although these shots here probably give that one away. So first, let's start with the ground effect vehicle concept that I want to play around with. There exists a thing called a skirtless hovercraft. It's basically just a flat-bottomed craft that blows air straight down through the bottom towards the ground. This seems like a cool concept, but I also wanted to integrate some lift and stability from forward flight like a normal airplane. So I thought I would borrow the downward-facing lifter motor idea from the hovercraft and apply it to my beloved flying sled ground effect vehicle design. My hope was that the additional airflow getting pumped under the wing from the lifter motors would collide with the oncoming air from forward flight and eliminate the need for a traditional hovercraft skirt or flat-bottomed surface like the skirtless hovercrafts have. Another concept I wanted to pull in was the deep chord lifting body. The flying sled here was really good at getting the most out of the ground effect. It felt like it was riding on a strong cushion of air that would hold it at just the right altitude. And I thought that this was mostly due to its deep wing chord. Chord is the length from the leading edge to the trailing edge, for those of you who don't know. Now if you read about the ground effect anywhere, one thing you'll see a lot is that the altitude at which the ground effect can start to be felt depends on the aircraft's wingspan. From this, most people seem to just assume that all you need for a great ground effect vehicle is a long wingspan, because the ground effect will extend higher up and be easier to fly within. I would argue that while a long wingspan can lead to ground effects being felt higher up, what matters more is the strength of the ground effect, and the wing chord has more of an effect on that. An aircraft with a thicker chord will do a better job at floating right above the ground without any pilot input. This is crucial because it's really difficult to fly low to the ground with close proximity, especially at RC scale. So with that said, I'm going to make this new design have an even deeper chord than the flying sled and see how that turns out. It's worth noting that my goal here is a strong ground effect feedback loop, not high efficiency. Narrower wing chords are definitely better for higher efficiency. So now that we have our fundamental design elements out of the way, we can start building. I used Onshape to sketch out the basic dimensions for everything. This is super useful to eyeball the overall shape of it before I start cutting foam. Onshape is free and cloud-based. That means all these design files are just a click away. If you want to access them, check the link in the description. The most intricate part of this design was the hovercraft ducts. These will hopefully be effective in pushing additional air under the vehicle, which would allow it to carry more weight and fly more slowly. After all the dimensions were worked out, it was time to start cutting foam. I'm making the wing and fuselage out of 6mm Depron. Here's beveling the control surfaces, and putting a carbon spar along the leading edge. And another carbon spar in the center. Actually, two more in the center. After the pontoons were all glued together, I covered them in packaging tape for durability. I always use a lot of packaging tape for builds like these. We got some popsicle stick control horns here, and that's the rudder. And I have some little L-shaped 3D printed brackets to help hold the vertical stabilizer up. I've got 3 servos on there for the control surfaces. I'm adding 2 pivoting motors to the front, just like the flying sled had. This allows us to do par thrust and more easily get up off the water. The hovercraft motors should help a lot with this too, but I wanted to do a before and after comparison. So these 2 par thrust motors should help us fly without the hovercraft motors. Here's wrangling all the electronics into the fuselage. I'm using a DragonLink 900MHz receiver and a little Omnibus F4 flight controller running ArduPilot Plane. It's also got a GPS connected. All these bare PCBs are waterproofed with epoxy. The wing was feeling a little floppy, so I added another layer of 6mm foam on the top to stiffen things up and give it a bit of a KF airfoil. After that, it was ready for test number 1.
Oh, it floats! Whoa, it par thrusts really nicely.
So, first impressions were that it worked really well, but not any better than the flying sled. At this point, I wasn't entirely sure if the difference was caused by the lack of winglets that the flying sled had, or if it was the lower aspect ratio wing. It was definitely not a pure ground effect vehicle by any means. It still had enough power and stability to fly at a ground effect, although it did so quite poorly. Another big difference between this one and the flying sled was that I didn't add steps to the bottom of the pontoons. This was because I was hoping that a flatter bottom would help form a better seal against the water and improve the hovercraft effect. From just flying it around like this, and with par thrust only, it doesn't seem like the flat bottom pontoons make any difference, but we'll see how it goes once the hovercraft motors are added. The downside of the flat bottom pontoons is that it does not plane over the surface of the water at all. After touching down, it just immediately decelerates, unlike the flying sled, which would skim across the surface a lot better. Look at the wake from the downwash, it's beautiful. And then, boom, it just stops super fast when it touches down on the water.
Today I added 2 batteries instead of just one, so it's heavier, and I also moved the batteries forward, so it's a lot more nose heavy. So let's give this a try. Wow, this thing is really struggling with the extra weight. It's super reliant on par thrust now because there's no step on the floats. The CG is so far forward, and yet it still seems tail heavy.
Here I was flying it up high to try and get the center of gravity figured out. The deeper the wing chord, the less sensitive an aircraft is to its angle of attack. That made it kind of difficult to tell where the center of gravity should be on an aircraft like this. I tried moving it super far forward, like less than 20% of the chord length from the nose, and that seemed to only improve performance. I was also disappointed at how much just one extra battery worth of weight seemed to impede performance. I thought it would be less sensitive for this since it's so big, but I guess not.
So all these problems I just mentioned would be pretty easy to fix with some simple adjustments, but I think it would be a lot more fun to try and solve them with hovercraft lifting motors instead. That sounds a lot more interesting.
Here's a little fun side experiment. This footage here was shot on the Sony Venice 2, which is the same camera that was used to film Top Gun Maverick, Avatar 2, and a bunch of other big budget films like that. Does it make my foam plane look like an F-16? Does it make me look like Tom Cruise? I think it looks pretty good, but the lighting wasn't great, and that's what makes the biggest difference in creating a cinematic looking image.
Oh, no wonder it wasn't working. One of my control horns broke off. Right there.
Oh, that's not good.
So at this point, I had a pretty good baseline feel of how this aircraft performed. So it was time to add the hovercraft motors and see how they changed things. I printed these ducts on my Flashforge Guider 3 Plus. I also cut some little wood insulator motor mount plates on the stepcraft so that the hot motors would not melt the PLA. Then I welded together the longest hex driver you've ever seen so I could reach the bolts that held the motor on. After that, I cut some holes for the ducts and glued them onto the wings. And I had to wire all those ESCs together as well. With all these hovercraft motors, I definitely should not need as much par thrust. This is with the hovercraft motors off. There's no chance it was going to have enough power to get up off the water with the front 2 motors alone. The hovercraft motors added too much extra weight, and I also moved the CG even further forward, which didn't help. Upon turning the hovercraft motors on for the first time, it became clear they were contributing to forward thrust a lot more than I had initially hoped. They would get it going forward pretty quick. I kinda missed on my initial vision for this project. I should have made the hovercraft motors more vertical like a quadcopter. I was initially planning on using a multi-rotor flight controller to control all 4 of the hovercraft motors and help stabilize the craft, but I didn't end up doing that because they had too much forward thrust, so they would get it going too fast, and then at that point you just have aerodynamic control surfaces to stabilize and don't need anything extra. But I will say that they did a pretty good job at making it fly a bit more like a hovercraft. It didn't seem to need as much forward airspeed to fly, and it was much better at popping up off the water quickly. I had the center of gravity super far forward, and it still seemed tail heavy at times. But I think this was just because the hovercraft motors were lifting the nose up too much. Sometimes I feel like the last remaining days of summer are too precious to spend walking through the grocery store and cooking. That's why I love when a new box of Factor shows up at my doorstep. Not only are these meals easy, but they're also delicious. Factor offers over 34 chef-prepared options, and I haven't found a single one that I didn't enjoy. Check out this pasta primavera with fresh cherry tomatoes, or this sun-dried tomato chicken. All of their meal options are dietitian approved, so you can feel good about saving time and eating well. And you'll feel well if you eat well, so signing up for Factor is a no-brainer. This creamy Dijon pork chop tasted so good that I couldn't believe it came in the mail. And this cheesy ground beef and cabbage was also delicious. When I'm busy with a project, these meals are a huge help because they save me so much time and allow me to focus on doing what I love. With Factor, you can rest assured that you're making a sustainable choice. They offset 100% of their delivery emissions and source 100% renewable electricity for their production sites and offices, and feature sustainably sourced seafood in their meals. This August, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose your meals and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed meals delivered straight to your door. Ready in just 2 minutes. No prep, no mess. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code RCTestFlight50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Now back to the video.
Today I added some little winglets in the back here, and those are gonna hopefully help give the rear of the craft more lift and help keep the nose down.
This thing was looking pretty cool from the front, but let's see how it performs. The wing extensions did seem to help with pitch stability a good bit. Overall, I think they were a good addition. Here are some hovercraft-esque takeoffs. It starts flying pretty much immediately, if you would call that flying. At one point, I tried unplugging the front 2 hovercraft motors so that only the rear 2 were doing anything. This actually seems to help with pitch control a bit. It seemed like they were contributing more towards lifting the aircraft vertically and not disturbing the pitch while doing so, probably because they were closer to the center of gravity. For that reason, I removed the front two lifter motors altogether. I also mixed the rear two in with the main motors so they would all have differential thrust control together, to hopefully improve yaw stability. It probably doesn't look any different because it was working pretty well in the first place, but it did feel a bit more stable in the air, so I think these modifications were an improvement. At one point, I tried unplugging the front two motors altogether.
So now we're only using the two lifter motors in the back. Wow, that's interesting. It appears that the front two motors are really important to get the nose up. Look at that, it's not going anywhere. Yeah, I'm going full up elevator and it's not flying.
Look at how when it comes back down, it doesn't even touch the water. It just bounces off the ground effect. That's how strong the ground effect is with this plane. Pretty impressive.
Wow.
So it seems to be working well enough at this point as to where it was time to start messing around with waypoint navigation. If this thing was going to be flying on its own, it needed a little extra help with keeping it at the right altitude. The ground effect is strong with this one, but not like a force field or anything. So I set up this little Arduino with a generic sonar rangefinder that would control the position of a servo proportionally based on its distance reading. I installed it on the aircraft so that the motor tilt angle was controlled by the sonar. Tilting the motors up for par thrust was very much necessary for getting this thing up off the water. This sonar setup did that automatically, so all I had to do to take off was raise the throttle. It seemed to work pretty well at first. Next I wanted to try a normal waypoint mission with normal ArduPilot with all the waypoints set to 1 meter of altitude. Upon flipping it into auto mode, the motors would just shut off, so it seemed like ArduPilot did not like having the waypoint altitude set so low. And then the sonar started tweaking out because it was wet.
So today I unplugged the throttle channels from the flight controller and plugged them directly into the RC receiver. So I have manual throttle control, and then the flight controller is doing all the steering. And we're gonna see if it'll do an autonomous mission that way. And going to auto mode. Seems to be working. It's kind of windy out there. I am afraid that I'm never gonna get this plane back. Okay, now it's too high. It's definitely flying the correct pattern though. It's working. It's totally working. It's just windy today.
Since this sonar seemed to be useless around water, I pulled it out and replaced it with this waterproof sonar I found.
Okay, first test with the new sonar. I've also uploaded this waypoint mission. It's a big loop. Hi ducks, hi ducks, hi ducks, hi ducks. Can I pet you please? They're so hydroscopic. Look at that. Water just rolls off of it. Oh, it's trying to turn too sharply.
Getting this thing to the point where it would never occasionally touch the water while in auto mode seemed impossible, especially while turning, since it does have a little bit of roll coupling. Unfortunately, it doesn't just turn completely flat with rudder only, and with these flat pontoons, it would just bog down immediately upon touching the water. So I wanted to add steps on the pontoons so that it would plane better on the surface instead of just instantly decelerating. I cut some squares out of thin fiberglass plate on the CNC machine and glued them onto the front of the pontoons.
Okay, I'm gonna test these new little fiberglass plates that I put on there this morning and see if they make it stay on plane more easily.
The plates helped a bit, but ultimately I think the approach angle on the front of the pontoons was too steep to really plane well. I never really designed this thing to be in contact with the surface, but oh well. It was also kind of oscillating with the altitude a bit.
I just reduced the gain of the motor tilt controller, so hopefully that'll prevent it from oscillating. Oh, it's oscillating again. God damn. Yeah, it's not very good. Too much throttle and it oscillates. Too little throttle and it flies too low, seemingly. So today I switched to a different sonar sensor that reads out data faster. And I also connected the throttle to the Arduino here as well. So not only is the rangefinder controlling the motor tilt angle, but it's also controlling the throttle.
So since controlling the motor tilt angle didn't seem to work all that well for controlling altitude, I decided to add throttle control to the Arduino as well. So this seemed to work much better, but it was still a little overtuned, so I reduced the range of the PWM steps that the Arduino had control over. This is basically equivalent to reducing the P-term. This got rid of the oscillations, and it was performing decently well, even in these non-optimal conditions. It was cool that this thing was working as well as it was with only a simple proportional controller. No complex PID stuff or anything like that. The sonar range was just mapped directly to the tilt servo and a portion of the throttle range. Super simple. After that, I tried carrying two 2170 4S 1P packs, and it actually seemed to work pretty well. This was really surprising, since at first it seemed to really struggle with any extra weight, but I think the 2 Hovercraft motors helped a lot with this. The next day I did some more autonomous testing and discovered that it worked really well if you just get the throttle midpoint set correctly. It was at this point that Surf Nico sent me one of their electric surfboards to try out. This thing turned out to be pretty sweet. It's easy to ride, super controllable, and reasonably fast. Since my ground effects vehicle can fly itself now, I got the idea to try chasing it with the surfboard while it flew around a circular waypoint mission.
Sebastian has arrived. Yo, what up, dude? Oh, Sebastian. Oh, you crashed your car, dude.
Sebastian was there to cut the motors in case anything went wrong.
Okay, you're good.
So Sebastian manually flew it out away from the first waypoint to turn around and get lined up to enter the waypoint mission tangent to the circle, so that the aircraft would not try and turn too sharply. And it was at this point right here that he flipped it into auto mode, and it didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't going to be able to keep up. I was at full throttle on the surfboard, and it was just a hair too slow.
Go faster, 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 faster.
But I figured that I could cut the circle short and catch up to it to get a quick shot at close proximity before it would outrun me. To try and go faster, I even laid down on the surfboard, but that did not really work. It was at this point that I made an amazing discovery. If I leaned back as much as I could on the board, it would go a tiny bit faster, probably because the nose would come up so it had less surface area touching the water, and a better intake angle for the jet impeller. Getting to ride alongside one of my aircraft and watch it skim across the water from close up was so cool. Its ability to stay within millimeters of the water's surface without touching it was just so majestic. Eventually, I got a little too close and swamped it with the surfboard's wake. Whoops.
Oh, no! I killed it!
So regarding this aircraft design, I think this project taught me that there's a sweet spot when it comes to wing chord length with ground effects vehicles, and this plane exceeded that a bit. So yeah, I think the chord was a bit too deep. It seems to me with chords deeper than about a 1-to-1 aspect ratio, the ground effect doesn't get any more potent as you near the surface, and it starts flying worse if anything. The aerodynamic efficiency in free flight goes down with a deeper chord too. After I had already finished this project, I found this interesting paper that said when you're really close to the ground, the length of the wing's chord is what has the most dominant effect on performance. Whereas when you're higher than one chord length, it's the wing's span that has the bigger effect on performance. Although, I think with small aircraft like RC models, it's difficult to even notice the ground effect when you're over one chord length high. So that could be a reason why I'm much more drawn to deep chord ground effect vehicles and not so much span-dominated ground effect vehicles. So now more about this surfboard. I've had a ton of fun riding this thing over the summer. It's kind of like being able to wakeboard without needing a boat. And taking it out early in the morning when the water's flat totally gave me surfing vibes, even though I don't live near a real surf break. All this slow-mo footage is shot on the FreeFly Ember high-speed camera, by the way. It looks pretty amazing. The surfboard is powered by a 20S lithium battery, which is around 84 volts when full. It has plenty of power for someone like me who weighs around 150 pounds. Honestly, I wouldn't want any more power. I think that riding fast at full throttle, like when I was chasing the ground effects vehicle, is a bit less enjoyable than cruising around at around half throttle. At slower speeds, it's smoother and you can lean the board over more easily for tighter turns. With some practice, you can really lean it over and carve, and even get low enough to drag a hand. Looking at the GPS speed data from the ground effects vehicle flight controller, we can see it was averaging around 10 meters per second, which was the maximum that the surfboard could do. That's 22 miles per hour or 36 kilometers per hour. The battery and motor weigh a lot, and it's not a very large board, so it does not have enough buoyancy to float your body weight very well. But that's okay, because when you throttle down and lean back, you can use the thrust from the motor to keep yourself up, even at really low speeds. It's super fun. Range-wise, I haven't really pushed this thing to its limits, but one morning I went 6 miles and it still had like 40% left in the battery. So you could probably go about 10 miles or so if you're just cruising. This would be around 40 minutes of runtime, which is plenty in my opinion. It's pretty easy to learn, especially if you have experience wakeboarding or surfing. I got up on my first try, and it just takes maybe 2 or 3 sessions to really get it figured out. My friends were having a blast trying it out too. It's a great activity if you have water nearby. If anyone is interested in this board, check it out at the link in the description and use my promo code to get a huge discount. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.